Let us begin now. For the first plenary session, I request Professor K. Mohammad Nazeeb to introduce the resource person, Dr. V. K. Karthika, Assistant Professor, NIT Trichy.
Thank you, Professor Safiq Pasha. Assalamu alaikum and good morning to everyone. I'm honored and pleased to welcome and introduce our resource person, Dr. Karthika VK, who is going to deliver a speech on mythological imprint on contemporary cultural and literary narratives. Dr. Karthika VK is an assistant professor of English in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the National Institute of Technology, Tiruchirappalli. Her profile is an inspiring one to share with you young researchers, scholars, and ELT fraternities. She was the second rank holder in her UG graduation, English Language and Literature from Mahatma Gandhi University, Kerala, and university topper and the gold medalist in PG graduation in comparative literature in the year 2008 from Pondicherry Central University. She completed her master's degree in TESOL studies from University of Leeds, England, UK. While pursuing TESOL, she had worked there as an ESOL instructor and assessor for ESOL examinations from 2009 to 2011. Subsequently, she obtained her doctorate in English language education from English and Foreign Languages University, FLU, Hyderabad, India. Her teaching philosophy is deeply rooted in social and emotional learning. She offers lectures and sessions on aviation English, Airports Authority of India, public speaking skills, MCH, RD, Institute of Telangana, continuing professional development and teaching and learning strategies and teaching pedagogies. Her research area interests are second language acquisition, second language learning strategies, multilingual education, cultural studies, employability skills and soft skills, critical pedagogy, and translation studies. Her research overviews that includes, she has created an awareness in raising of speaking strategies and oral proficiency in English and multilingual settings. Further, her research focuses on learner motivation, metacognitive awareness, learner strategies, learner autonomy, and self-directed learning. In 8 years of her teaching career and 5 years of doctoral research, her articles were published in journals of national and international repute. She is actively involved in curriculum development and material production as well. She also explores the possibilities and challenges of teaching language in Indian multilingual context. Dr. Karthika VK is currently involved in research in the field of aviation English and develops materials for training in aeronautical communications. Dr. Karthika VK is a proud recipient of many awards and scholarships. To name a few, Tetley and Lupton Scholarship from University of Leeds, England, UK, the year 2008, Community Care Award for teaching from Word of Grace Learning Center, Leeds, England, Oxford, Cambridge, and RSA certificate in adult literacy, UK. She has acted as a resource person in various national and international seminars, conferences, and teacher development programs conducted by various universities across the country. She is also associated with a professional association with like LTI and IATEFL. She has involved in publishing books and book chapters on ELT. She has presented papers in national and international conferences and seminars, which truly mark her academic excellence. Finally, Dr. Karthika VK has also involved herself in many academic responsibilities and social outreach activities. Once again, on behalf of all the faculty members of Department of English in the New College and those who are part of this virtual conference, I welcome Dr. Kartika. Doctor, now the dais is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for the profound introduction. It's a humbling experience listening to you, Mohammed, sir, talking about me. Yes, I would try to do justice to what you have accounted me for. Well, people who have listened to my introduction might be wondering what do I do today here, because largely it's about ELT research, English language training, developing curriculum and all those things. So what do I do here? Might be a question that would be there in your mind. Well, literature was always there, I would say, in my blood. I divorced literature when I focused myself more on, or I rather prefer to look at English language and the intricacies of the learning teaching problems. There I had a rift between me and literature as an academic subject in quotes. But later, I realized that even if I try to divorce this literary studies, it won't go away from me. It's always there with me. Whenever I watch a film, when I look at an advertisement, or when I listen to somebody speaking, I keep on taking that, lens of a critic, and I start analyzing it. So it's always there with me. Therefore, I think I will try to do my best to communicate what's there in my mind about this particular topic that I would be talking to you today. And one thing I would like to tell you before I start straight away would be people who are so much involved in literary studies, cultural critiques, they might be wondering, why is mythological criticism or archetypal criticism or perhaps even psychoanalytic criticism so significant in recent days? Aren't these tell-told methods? Aren't we holding new lenses of post-coloniality or post-humanism, memory studies? Aren't we talking about different paradigms in literature and cultural studies? Why should we even look back at myths, mythology, archetypes, archetypal criticism, psychoanalysis? Aren't this all old stories? We'll be questioning. I mean, so many of us will be questioning. I would like to try to give an answer to these questions, at least to lead your thoughts into this direction of looking back at your past and looking forward to our future, deeply being rooted in our present. So let me just begin my presentation. I have a PowerPoint presentation here. Let me just see if I can share the screen. Usually Google Meet actually plays with me. So let me just try that. Next one, please. Yes, the second point, I was just explaining that. Yes, so I was telling you that the compulsion to give expression to our innate thoughts, they got manifested as quotes, pictures, and perhaps, or maybe simultaneously as words. So shrieking voices and all later became sound. So we have all these onomatopoeia concepts, Bow-wow theory, or hip-hop theory, all about how we develop language. And over to the next point, if we can see that. Okay. The diverse and distinctive cultural groups were there. The human beings were grouped together very differently. They had a community spirit. They were all grouped together. But then the groups were separate. The individuals were separate. But then different individuals come together to constitute a group. And then there are some comments, sir. Please show the slides in slideshow mode. I think that will be better actually, even for me, because there is some element that I don't want to disclose straight away. So if you could present it in the slideshow mode, it would be better. Yes, over to the third point. Yes, thank you. So diverse distinctive groups of human beings will have diverse myths. So what are myths? Myths are actually some stories that that all of us have within us. Okay, it's something so innate. It's all those personal anecdotes that we have. But then, is it just personal or is it collective of a group? That is something that we need to think about and explore more. Over to the next point. So mythical stories are common in all communities. So common stories are there, and myths and mythical stories are quite common in all kind of cultures. So each cultural group will have a separate story, a separate set of myths for their own cherishment or their own nourishment. Okay, and people who are atheists, even people who do not believe in gods, they are trying to appreciate the beauty of and artistic values of these myths. So why I brought in atheists here is okay. Yeah, I keep on hearing something. That's why I just stopped. Right. So why did I bring in the point of atheists here? Is because most of the mythical stories in their development course will get an aura of devotion, or they fit into certain religious frameworks. And whatever stories we hear as part of mythology, mostly they have something to do with the religious part of it generally. If you think about it, you will understand. I don't want to name any particular one as of now, but we will eventually discuss many of them. So at the moment, I'll just leave it to your imagination. You just need to connect it. How these mythological stories have some or other connection with devotion, something about somebody being a titan or somebody being omnipresent, omnipotent, and the collectivities or the group's devotion towards that particular figure. Okay, so therefore it becomes a religious kind of narrative. And even when it becomes a religious kind of narrative, so many of the atheists or radicals or liberals or people with liberal ideology, they still appreciate the artistic value of it. So what is it so artistic about these kind of mythologies? What is that aesthetic quality of this particular myths or mythologies is what we would be discussing. Over to the next slide, please. Human perceptions. Yes, human perceptions of aesthetic beauty. So I'll begin with what Erich Fromm had to talk about myth. Actually, when we don't have the slideshow mode on, the surprise is gone, but doesn't really matter. You all know what I'm talking about because we share the collective unconscious. So myth is a message from ourselves to ourselves, a secret language which treats inner as if outer event. I found this to be quite strong and beautiful. Okay, it's beautiful at the same time. It's very strong. It's a message from me to myself. Okay, I send it. I transact it between me and myself, and then it's a secret language which treats my inner self as if an outer event. So when something that I envisage in my mind, or when I find something that I imagined, or when I can connect with something that is innate in myself with something that happens in the outer world, just think about you. Just think about you imagining, you affiliating yourself, or you getting attached to something that you see on a screen. Say, for example, you watch a film and you feel like your cathartic process is happening. Your purgation of emotions, all those things are happening while watching something that you can distantly relate. But why do we appreciate that, either with applauses or with tears? Why do we appreciate that art form, that cultural product? How do we do that? How do we associate ourselves with that? It's because we send a message across our own self and to the outer world. So myth is a message from myself to myself. It's a secret language that treats myself as an outer event. Okay, it links between what I can see as a cultural appreciation on the screen or in a book or on the wall. You know, you look at the Facebook walls these days, you can see a lot of self-expressions, and we have different perspectives coming up, and then to one or two we will find ourselves attached. Why does it happen? Our ideology is shaped with several myths, several personal myths that we are subjected to. Understanding symbols helps us reach the hidden layers of our own personalities, and it will connect us with our common human experiences. So I have my own layers of personality. So when I understand signals or symbols, then I try to understand, I try to introspect, retrospect, and find more about my own layers of personality. So it demands a lot of thinking. Okay. So when you start thinking in those lines, you will be establishing a more concrete or a better idea of your own personality. And then similarly, when you go on understanding yourself, this is what all philosophies or all religions is always talked about. You know, you need to know thyself. You need to know yourself. Okay. So when you know more about yourself, you will establish a kind of unseen connection with everybody. Okay. So isn't that the purpose of literary studies? Why are we studying literature? Why are we teaching literature? Isn't it for the larger vision of embracing the entire concept of humanity? Isn't it to be more humane? When you read a literature of quality, you become more and more humane. You become a better human being. Isn't that the purpose of literary studies? Isn't that the purpose of criticism and critiquing the literary works? Are we only consuming Othello as a person who killed his wife? Or are we just investigating the intricacies that were there in his decision to kill his wife? And are we just interrogating into the death of Ophelia? Are we doing a lot of self-inquiry when we read literature and when we try to appreciate literature? And isn't that the entire purpose of isn't that the entire purpose of teaching and learning literature? Right. So I will move on. Values and aesthetic beauty that is inherent and innate in oneself gets visibility through art forms, poetry, and other literary forms. So everything that is innate, it gets a representation. Now we have human language. That's where I started. You know, the caves, the walls of the caves will have scribblings. The caves of the walls, the walls of the caves will have scribblings, pictures. So when you look at it, you will understand somebody is in dire need of communicating. And now things are very easy. We have got human language, and we created even different languages. We coded different languages. If you look at it, Bahubali, you have a gibberish language which has been created, which is not coded. But if you look at that old film, Avatar, you can see the Pandora's language. It's a purely coded language. The linguist took so much of time and effort to create that particular language. So we code things, okay? And values and our own inherent beauty or our own connect, that link with which we connect with the outer world, it gets manifestation through art forms, poetry, and other type of literary forms. And we humans weave an unseen thread of identification with the content of that art. What we see as the outer world, with that we establish a kind of unseen connection, an invisible thread we weave it through. And self being identified with that other, which manifests as art. That is where we feel like, okay, we sympathize with the character on the screen, or we sympathize with the character in the book, or we feel very much alienated with one person. So I'm not talking about the Brecht epic theater kind of concept. I'm talking about the cathartic values that the Greek theater has always posited or always postulated. Right. So let me just move on to the next slide. Nature, humans, and myths. Yes, thank you very much. So I'll take one quote from Mann. who talks extensively about myths and their relationship with human minds. Myth is the foundation of life. It is a timeless pattern, the religious formula to which life shapes itself. Very interesting. And there is one concept that I just touched upon in the beginning, the religious formula to which life shapes itself. So the primitive, primordial human beings, they were responding to certain events that the nature presents to them. For example, if there is an earthquake, imagine, or a big fire happening, immediately there is something that, it's just like the Greek concept of pity and fear. There is fear, a great deal of fear within them. So how did they respond to that? Maybe through voice, through actions, and sometimes through symbols or signs. They might have responded. And some of them are unconsciously translated or transposed into a religious framework. This needs a little bit of explanation, how these myths get formulated into a religious framework. I'm not going to give you an entire clue about it, but let me just touch upon a few points with which you can actually think and come up with ideas on your own. So imagine a powerful person in a clan. Let us all go back to those primordial times. Okay, there is a person in a particular group. Let us identify ourselves as a tribe, and there is a particular person who is pretty stronger than all of us. Okay, and the person protects us. The person scolds us in whatever way, maybe through sound, shrieking voices, or maybe by smashing us, whatever. Let us take it as a he conveniently. Let me not be a female-oriented or gender-neutral person now. Let's take it as a he for the pure convenience of our discussion. So he protects us from outside attacks, say, for example, by animal attack, but he punishes us, and we quite easily, even though he belongs to our own clan, we quite easily understand that or make sense of this phenomenon of making or creating a very conscious kind of alienation from this particular person. So we place him a little higher than us in the hierarchical order. And we think that, okay, this is a guardian. This is a person who can punish for our crimes. This is a person whom we have to actually respect, pay regards to. So eventually, this kind of an alienation with regard to that person's ability to protect you, safeguard you, punish you, based on fear, based on your own fear, slightly there will be a reformulation of your identity. Suddenly, all the other people will have a different set of identity, though all of us belong to the same tribe. We collectively become part of the people who are ruled, and that person becomes a ruler. And imagine the ruler is gone, then the person to succeed will be elected. And based on the values that we have created around the first figure, we attribute the same values to the person who succeeds, to the person who succeeds him as well. So that is how the value system is being generated. When there is an element of devotion, it becomes a religious practice. So that is how myths are being put into the framework, or put into the religious framework, and becomes stories that we tell all the time. Okay, I will stop.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yes?
Ma'am, may I interrupt you for a minute, ma'am?
Sure.
Ma'am, your voice is not clear because many persons feel that if you could use a microphone, it will be very clear to us, ma'am.
I'll do one thing. I'll turn off my camera so that I think it will be a little clearer.
Okay.
Is it any better now?
Okay.
Yes,
Can I proceed now?
Yeah, sure.
Yes,
sure,
ma'am, please.
Please proceed, ma'am. Yes,
Yeah, I hope I'm audible now. So I told you some of these myths are unconsciously translated and transposed into a religious framework, and conscious and unconscious actions and symbols, when narrated, become mythical stories. So this is a little tricky. When you have conscious kind of efforts to produce certain symbols, and when you narrate it, then it also becomes mythical stories. How? The mythical imagination will intertwine with the social realities that you are exposed to. So you have some ideas, you have some imagination, and then what happens? You have some stark social realities right in front of you. And you are a human being. You cannot escape from thinking and analyzing, even if you want. You keep on thinking about things. And then when you juxtapose what social realities are there in front of you with the mythical imagination that you have, they'll mingle and eventually contribute to the construction of epic-like narratives. So new mythologies or new mythical narratives are being constructed, and sometimes when the social reality is there, some factual information is there, and when you connect the myths with the fact or fact with the myth, it will get woven into the fabric of these epic narratives. How? I'll tell you in a while. Over to the next slide, where I would like to discuss you about discuss with you the myths and epics. Mythical imagination and social realities usually get reflection in epics, but you cannot just bisect them. You cannot just say that an epic can be just an epic and myth can be just a myth. It is possible to separate them. We deconstruct everything these days. You know, everything is deconstructed, reverse engineering. Everything happens these days. We are with artificial intelligence. We can code, decode, encode. Everything is possible. Even in literature, we go for deconstructing so many ideas and ideologies and all. But when we think about it, your identity as a human being, it's not just you as a social being, you as an emotional being, or you as a psychological entity or physiological entity. You are a congregation of all these identities. So you as a you, I as a me, should be the physiological Kartika, psychological Kartika, emotional and social Kartika. So all these identities should club together to form the entity called me, myself, I. Okay, so in that case, when all these myths are embedded into these epic narratives, we cannot just say that I'm studying the epic, but I don't look at the myths that are covering it. You need to think about it. I'm not giving all answers to all questions that I pose in a very different manner. I don't incline to give any kind of answers. I would like you people to take up the cues and then think about it. So mythical narratives are embedded into the fabric of epics in an inseparable manner. And if you separate it, you cannot find an identity of its own for an epic, because an epic is a collective of all these myths as well. So collective unconscious of human communities, which are distantly separated in time and space, do have similarities thanks to the existence of these symbols. Okay, so Jung talked about collective unconscious. I'm not going into a lot into Jungian philosophy or Jungian psychology, but let me just touch upon it. He talks about the human minds being islands in the sea. So if you look at it, one might be in the Pacific Ocean, one might be in the Atlantic, one might be in the Indian Ocean. There are so many islands. If you look at them, they are all distant. Okay, they're not connected. They're all individual, separate. You can imagine that. But just go through that, just go through a little more deeply into that thought. Then you can identify that all these islands are connected, deeply rooted onto the seabed. It's deeply rooted to the seabed, which means there is a platform, there is a ground on which all these individual islands are deeply, deeply rooted. A cultural bed, a collective consciousness bed, so that I can be similar to you. Sometimes we think that, okay, that person exactly thinks like me, or this writing is pretty much similar to that writing, but I cannot call it as plagiarism. Why does that happen? For example, Aristotle's Poetics and how he defines a hero has a lot more things in common with how Bharat Muni describes his Natya Shastra and how he describes the concept of Nayak. A lot more similarities are there in Indian aesthetics and Greek poetics. How does that happen? We can trace it back to the commonality that we all have by stringing us together as one human entity. I reiterate, all literature teaching, all liberal arts teaching should be a weapon, or should be, more positively, should be a tool for all of its stakeholders to understand the deeper inner self of oneself, and also to understand that I am the same as the other person. So if you think about that in a larger humanitarian perspective, will there be any wars? Will there be any conflicts? And of course, in a society, there should be conflicts. But the kind of conflicts that we witness these days in terms of religion, in terms of political identity, will those be there if we establish that larger connection? And isn't it that literature calls for? Isn't it that literature points to? We need to think about it. Most of you might be literature students or teachers. So I would really like you to think about this humanitarian consideration when you talk to your students or your fellow researchers or fellow students or friends about literature and its social implications. Over to the next slide. With this, I would like to move on to a little bit of past, the Greek narrative of Agamemnon, which is present in Iliad. So I'll just narrate the story in 1 or 2 sentences. Many of you might know it, but then just for getting you into this thing, I'll just I'll just tell you the story. So Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, they have a son called Orestes. Agamemnon's brother or cousin Augustus plots against Agamemnon, and Clytemnestra, being very instrumental in this plotting, with her help, Agamemnon is killed by Augustus. Okay, so powerless Orestes was for some time, but then he comes back and he kills and he avenges his father's death. So Orestes kills Augustus and then take the country back. Fine. Now over to the next slide, which also talks to you about Greek epic or a Greek narrative. It's a story of Cronus and his mother Gaia. So Gaia's husband is Uranus. Uranus is it's equal to heaven, and Gaia is equal to earth. Please note the point. And then their son Cronus. Cronus actually plots against his father, and with the help of mother, he actually eradicates his father. I don't want to go into the details, so let me just be very simple about it, okay? And later he got married to Rhea. There is an incestuous element as well, which I don't want to dwell deep into. So Cronus and Rhea have children, and then all those children, Cronus envisaged that they will repeat the kind of destiny that he gave for his own father Uranus. So he didn't want to be a surrogate Uranus. So what he wanted to do was to kill all his children. So he did that, but then Rhea managed to save Zeus, the last child. And Zeus came back in power and kills Cronus. So you can see that there is a power, and then there is a challenge to the power with the help of somebody who is in the clan itself. Okay, so Zeus remains unmarried, and therefore still people think that he lives happily ever after in his own kingdom. I have no idea. That's the Greek mythological story. Now the most famous one, which you cannot skip, which is Oedipus Rex. The king of Thebes, Laius and Jocasta, has the son Oedipus, and the oracle of Delphi says that, or professes that, he will kill the father and marry the mother. So here there is a bigger aspect to it. And then hearing this, Laius decides to kill Oedipus, and then he gives the child to the mother. Again, the mother is the one who gave birth to, and she has the power to kill, is what these men are believing, I believe, I don't know. So Jocasta was entrusted with Oedipus to just eliminate him from the world. And then Jocasta couldn't do it, being the mother, so she cannot just go against Laius' order. So what she does is she gave the child to a servant, and that's the end of the story. Okay, but then it didn't end there quiet. The child was handed over to Polybus and Merope of Corinth, and he grew up as the prince of Corinth. Later he realizes that Polybus and Merope may not be his parents, so he wanted to consult the oracle of Delphi, and he goes to Delphi and he asks, who are my parents? And Delphi, the oracle gives him a very different answer. It says that you will kill your father and marry your mother. Being horrified of hearing this, he immediately leaves the place, and he thinks that he should leave Corinth, and he travels to Thebes. So on the way, he met Laius, who was coming to consult the oracle, and then they had an ego problem. There was a bit of arrogance and all. One person has to move away for the other person to go on. But being, what they are or what they were, they didn't. They ended up being in a fight, and finally, he killed, or Oedipus killed Laius, thereby, and then getting the country as well. So the person who kills the king will get the kingdom and the queen. So, hello? Okay, the Delphi's prophecy became, the oracle's prophecy became true that way. So remember this concept. And now one more, Amleth story, that's a Scandinavian legend. So Hovendel and Gerutha, I hope you will connect. You are all literature people, so you will connect Amleth with somebody. So Hovendel and Gerutha, and Hovendel has a brother called, had a brother called Feng, and with Gerutha's help, Feng murders Hovendel, and Amleth, the son, comes back and avenges for his father's death. Okay, now, yeah, Shakespeare's Hamlet. So Amleth is the source for Hamlet. Senior Hamlet, Gertrude, and Hamlet's uncle Claudius plots with Gertrude and kills Senior Hamlet. Still, it's an enigma. Okay, and then you know what happens here. Hamlet doesn't rule the country; he kills himself. He gets killed. So it doesn't go to the other extent, like getting the country. That bit is not there. Now we have a common thread in all these stories. There is a powerful person, with the help of somebody from his own clan, he gets killed by a close relative. Okay, and then his own blood comes back and fights, and then gains attains the country back. So this is the common thread that runs through all these stories. If you think about our own epics or our own narratives or our own films that come recently, think about your Godfather stories. You will have so many Godfather stories, right? In Tamil, in Hindi, there are so many Godfather type of stories. I am very sure that you people have watched the Hollywood film Godfather. So there is a powerful person, and when that person gets eliminated, there is somebody else coming to succeed the person. So that is the Godfather chain. And you will have so many myths covering, you'll have so many myths, okay? Yeah, I get some kind of disturbance. That's why I just stop in between. Sorry about that. Let's move on. Over to the next slide. Murray's interpretation. Yes, thank you. So here, Gilbert Murray says that all this thread could be related to the change in seasons. So if you have read about the seasons in the West, you know that it's pretty evident. It's not like how we have it in India. So when there is a winter coming, when there is winter time coming, everybody changes the watch. The clock will be tuned back or forth half an hour or 1 hour extra or less, depending on the country that they are in. And then they'll go for woolen clothes. They'll buy new jackets. If it is a summer, they'll plan the colorful clothes. They'll plan their holidays accordingly. They'll book their holiday slot. So one person's entire life is being constructed by the or reformulated by the upcoming season. In other countries, in India also, if you have gone through this beautiful short story of O. Henry, I'm sure you all must have read some of them, Soapy and the Anthem, I think. The Cop and the Anthem. Sorry, The Cop and the Anthem. So if you have read it, you will understand how a person prepares to get into a prison because it's winter time and he needs warmth and food. Similarly, the kind of upcoming of any kind of season will have a long lasting or at least for a long period will have some repercussions on a person's life. So here the myth is that one season overrides the other and embraces the nature. This is a common connection in all these stories, and Gilbert Murray connects it with the nature actually. So he gives an ecological point of view to this mythical interpretation of all these stories. The common myth of one powerful person being killed by another person and then claiming the wife or claiming the kingdom. It is getting reflection in Murray's perceptions or ideas or ideology into this paradigm where one season dominates the other and then takes over the earth. So this triangular story of winter, summer, and earth, and motifs of murder, battles, and governance. So if you go back to the stories of the Ramayana and Mahabharata, you will find the same kind of thing. Vali and Sugriva, or Karna and Arjuna. All these ordeals will have a lot of similarities with the Greek myths that are narrated. And this winter taking. So in the Indian context, let's assume that it's summer and monsoon. Okay, and if you look at it, there are so many associations that we can, so many archetypes that will come up, and so many connections that we can establish with the concept of sun and moon and rain. If you look at the names itself, so I don't have time to go into all those details. So let me just wind it up quickly because I am still with the past. I haven't come to the present. So most of the myths have symbolic representations of the earth being the female figure and sun being the male protagonist. So these are leading to the archetypal images of that. Now, let me talk about these myths. How are they being presented in our modern narratives? So there are two ways in which the narratives are being interpolated by the myths, or myths are getting incorporated into the modern narratives. Of course, the direct denotations to the myths and then indirect representation of the myths. So when you look at the direct denotations, you can see that myths or mythology is as such telecast on a TV as a TV serial or made into films, novels. You can think about all those old stories, legends and epics, all those things coming, the Ramayana, Mahabharata, retelecasting or showcasing it as it is. So many films are made, biblical stories are made into films, Arabian Nights are made into films. So there are so many direct kind of reproduction of such myths or mythology, and these retelling in my perception, these retellings have actually got a very solid social, religious, or political purpose. It's not something naive that some serials are coming at one point of time. It has a strong social and religious political context to that reproduction at one point of time. Okay, earlier that was recorded, by why is it being telecast again? Or why is it being shown again? It has a strong social, religious, political purpose, which I would explain in the next slide. And then indirect representation of all these myths are not, it's not that they will say that this is the myth that we are going to discuss, but then myths are not directly acknowledged, but they serve as the undertone of the major narrative. So if you have a film and if you have this lens of a critique, you can actually identify that there is a myth running through it. Otherwise, there is nothing. It's pretty modern. Okay, it's pretty modern, and you don't see that. A very old movie for you people if you're really young, and for people of my age, we may still remember there was a Tamil movie called Kadalukku Mariyadai. Which was a remake of one of the Malayalam films. That's why I related it. And in that film, there was a beautiful Freudian psychoanalytical concept rolling in, you know, this Oedipus complex getting narrated, but nobody could understand that. Only a person who is trained in looking at it with a psychoanalytical lens would realize that yes, there is a strong Oedipus complex stuff going on. Otherwise, nobody would understand. Similarly, if you actually carry that lens with you, you will be able to decode a lot of modern narratives and trace it back to the myths that were always there as part of our collective unconscious. Okay, and myths are criticized and retold more in a metaphorical sense. That's a very different idea. So recently, the myths are criticized and retold more in a metaphorical sense. So I would explain that quite quickly. But before that, I need to take you through a very different aspect of it. Yes, direct representation of myths. Mythologies are culturally reproduced, as I told you, like TV serials are produced based on the Hindu Puranas or Arabian Nights, different things, okay, to serve various purposes, affirm certain religious identity, patriotism, and national culture. Whose agenda, that is unknown, and I'm not going to discuss that. And a desire to return to an often ideally imagined past, as well as a need to challenge it to emerge into a new future. So I view it with this paradigm of Partha Chatterjee, actually. So when we are actually reproducing a myth directly, there are two ways in which we approach it. The first one is that we actually imagine a wonderful past. Okay, we have a tradition, we have a past in which we believe in all these value sets, okay, which transforms into these mythical stories or mythological stories. So we cherish that. We have a past that we cherish, and at the same time, certain aspects of it has to be challenged to emerge into a culture. Okay. If I go into that, it will be more political. So I won't go deep into that for a plenary session like this. If it was more like a workshop, yes.
Excuse me, ma'am. Ma'am, is it possible for you to wind up in 5 minutes, ma'am?
I will. Certainly. Sure. In another 5 minutes, I'll be winding up. Thank you. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Right. So I'll be quick. Yes, so the project of Indian nationalism, it divides the world of social institution into two domains, the material and the spiritual. Please go and read this work of Partha Chatterjee, where he talks about modernism and its different domains. It's very important for any literature savvy person to go through these two domains. So the material domain is where the outer world is functioning. For example, me being in the modern domain, I dress up in the modern way. I use all the modern gadgets that the Western world has largely contributed to the building of. And then I maintain my own spiritual domain. That is the realm of home, the roles of females, religious, indigenous, cultural values and all. So I cherish my own past, and then therefore I hold it close to my heart and fiercely in an attempt to protect from what is believed to be the distinctly different colonial culture and its power. So I want to protect that culture. So that is a spiritual domain. So there is a conflict between this material domain and spiritual domain, and we are always into it. And Indian national imagining has been consistently supplemented by a wealth of feelings, especially a kind of yearning for a pristine past and equations with religious devotions. And it is to this particular spiritual domain that the mythologies and their retellings belong to. More than this, I don't want to make it precise, okay? I hope you are all smart enough to get what I say. So now, let me just move on to the indirect representation of myths. And myths operate as a platform for the modern narrative, as I said. Some examples, Snehalata Reddy's Sita. It is retelling. It produces the myth as such, but then it views it from a different perspective. It views it from a feminine perspective, a female perspective, and criticize it and criticize the role of Rama. Similarly, Maniratnam's film Ravan, it also criticizes. And there is a Malayalam movie maker, Anjali Menon, whose film has been got into different languages, Bangalore Days. It also has the myth of Savitri. So if you look at the Satyavan Savitri myth, I don't see any other movie projecting it better than the film Roja. So there is a female who is powerless, but who is a pativrata, and she goes on to any kind of adventure to find out her husband or to claim her husband back. So the myths are always there, embedded in all the stories that are around us. And then another archetype or motif is the travel, the journey. Okay, hero or heroine goes for a voyage. And if you look at these three works that I have mentioned here, Where Shall We Go This Summer, Ancient Promises, and Lady's Coupe, you can see that Lady Oedipus is on her travel, and she is slaying so many monsters and all, but the monsters are not outside, it's all inside. Okay, she's killing all those fears and anxieties. Just like if you have watched the Hindi film Zindagi Na Milege Dobara, how they overcome their fears, how the Freudian trio who are picturized in this film overcome their fears by slaying the monsters that are within them and achieve that kind of self-realization is very important. I am winding up very soon. You can see my thank you slide. So indirect representation of myths, actually new myths are being created largely around the female myths, myths of subjugation, myths of victimization, myths as metaphors. So if you look at the hashtag #MeToo moment also, you can trace it back to certain myths. If you look at the Nirbhaya incident and the comments that are coming up, you can see that there are new myths around the female subjugation are being created in India. So how are we going to interpret these things? How are we going to evaluate the memes that are populating or that are flying over the social media platforms? How are our unedited kind of thoughts representing a lot of mythical imprints, or how are they having, or how are they being embossed with the myths that we are nurturing within ourselves, knowingly or unknowingly? So over to my last and final slide. Myths are everywhere, permeating our lives. Films, social discourses, literature, and even some popular songs that we hum. Okay, the Enjami song, if you go back, you can understand, do carry mythical underpinnings. Analyzing the various cultural products through the mythical lens will reveal the present meaning that is rendered to the narrative. There may be political, social, or gender agenda for metaphorically employing myths into a narrative. If you look at your films, if you look at contemporary literature and hold this lens, you will understand that all intricacies and complexities of human minds get artistic rendition most of the time. Okay, a myth that you identify might be just a seashell that you pick at the shore. That world of meaning might be the sea in front of you. If you try measuring the sea using that small shell, just like how you try to carry a bit of water with that broken seashell, will you be successful? It will be just a dream to measure the entire ocean with that seashell. But we all have our own dreams. I have my own dreams, you have your own dreams, and we keep on making meaning. We go on dreaming. Therefore, we go on making meaning. And please do so. And I wish you all the best for a happy meaning making through these lenses that I have discussed. Thank you very much. I rest my case here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Karthika VK. It was profound and overwhelming. And since you have quoted this Godfather movie, there is this famous quotation from Marlon Brando. I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse. So here I just want to connect this quotation to the topic what you have dealt with, and it was a wonderful session where you have taken the whole lot of clans, the literary clans, to the nostalgic feeling, where you have taken us to the primitive age and the myths that prevails in different cultures and religious faiths, and also introducing some of the literary stalwarts, the figures, and the Greek mythology, and a whole lot of stuff. Thank you so much, Doctor. Now I'm just inviting audience for the QA session. Audience, if you have questions, please you can throw your questions to Dr. Kartika VK. Yeah, it goes for some 5 minutes. Thank you.
Naseeb sir?
Yes, sir. Hadi sir.
Yes. I would like to ask a question to
please
Dr.
go.
Kartika. Ma'am, that was a very beautiful presentation. I know you were talking about how in modern days, TV serials come out with reproduction of Ramayana, Mahabharata. They want to show those epics. On the other hand, like what you see is a lot of novelists, especially women novelists, they try to revisit. They try to retell the stories of epic characters. For instance, Sita. Like a whole lot of novels have come. They try to retell. Like what could be the reason for that? Can we say like they're trying to revisit those myths in order to create an egalitarian society wherein they want to find out the patriarchy which is embedded in that? Or maybe the other thing, the reproduction of TV serials, is that an attempt to reinforce the values? Oh, like the past is very glorious and people are not following those things, so they want the order to be reset. Can we say like there is a kind of war, a battle going on between right-wing ideology and left-wing ideology? Can we put it that way?
Exactly, sir. That is why I kept on mentioning at various points of my talk that if I talk further, it's going to be pretty political, and over a platform like this, I doubt if I could be so political. So you are exactly right. The two things that you asked, one is about the treatment of the old myths or mythologies by the modern women writers. They want to revisit the question of how females were portrayed in the previous time. So when they talk about females, usually Sita, Tara, Savitri, all those females who were quite belonging in course to the patriarchal norms of the society are being projected. But at the same time, there is a woman called Jabala whose character was questioned, and she tells her son, this is from the Upanishad, she tells her son Satyakama to go and tell his guru who asked for his parenthood or to know the knowledge of who is his father. She tells him, go and tell your guru that you are Satyakama, the son of Jabala, and you don't have a father. Just say that. So she was claiming her space, she was claiming her identity. But how many of us know Jabala? Most of us know Sita, most of us know Urmila, and we keep on cribbing about how their sufferings were and glorifying that kind of victimization that they had. Recently, there is a case that came out in Kerala about a girl being absconded from her surrounding for 10 years. And she was found in a house which was close by, and she went with her lover. And the lover's family was very much there. Nobody understood that this girl was there for 10 years. For 10 long years, this girl was inside that home, and nobody realized that this girl was there. And after 10 years, she comes out and says that she was in love with this person, and therefore she belonged there. Now, the social media is infested with discussions on both sides, that it's a glorification of their love affair, criticism of the society which didn't allow an intercaste marriage, and at the same time, was there any violation of human rights there? So in a similar lens or in a similar light, the female writers are also criticizing all these myths. The works that I have mentioned, Snehalata Reddy Sita, she is questioning actually just so much similarity with Maniratnam's Ravan as well, that kind of a Sita figure. She is asking, was I actually doomed to have gone through all these fire tests and everything else? And couldn't I avoid that? And why should you ask me to do that? So it's like the modern sensitivity or the kind of awareness of one's own self and claiming oneself back coming to the forefront, and the females are asking all those questions back to themselves. Do I belong to this prototype that was created, or could I just think about another way of them reflecting on it? Draupadi being a wife of 5 men. Can I not just walk out of that paradigm and think about it in a different way? That is the question that they posed. And secondly, what you have asked about was the retelecasting, which is really, really political. Yes, as I told you, in the Partha Chatterjee paradigm, if we look at it, it's pretty political. It's to claim the glorious past back and then to remind everybody who is a subscriber to that to understand that, okay, this was our value system. You are diverting from that, and you have to be you have to be belonging. I keep on repeating that word. You should belong to that particular paradigm that our great ancestors have portrayed. We don't challenge that. Okay, we just go ahead criticizing our own present practices and try to balance that spiritual and material domain. So the people who telecast it, or the powerful persons up there in the hierarchical ladder, they are telling us to watch it and to get purged.
Yes, thank you for the first plenary session, and I would appreciate all the audience for staying patient. Thank you so much, and you have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, everyone.